Hello, everybody. Welcome to all our panelists and all our viewers. This is a joint and an intercluster roundtable, which is held by the IR and public policy team at the Center for New Economic Studies. And today's topic is understanding the Sri Lankan economic crisis, and we are going to delve into the nuances of it and how it happened and what are the implications for for the country itself and also for India-Sri Lanka relations today. And today we are joined by Shani, Malika, Mia, and Soumya, and myself, Krishanu, and we'll be talking more about the Sri Lankan economic crisis. Without further ado, we can directly delve into the questions. Uh, so before moving on to other aspects, can anybody provide a brief summary of what basically essentially led to the crisis and what were the causes, the factors that were responsible for it? And yes, anybody? Yes. Shani, Soumya.
Sure. So when I talk about the crisis that is going on in Sri Lanka right now, I think this is the perfect example I could quote when I talk about the influence of politics and religion appeal in terms of affecting the economic decisions. So all this began around 2019 when there were elections going on and and the campaigning was going on, and Rajapaksa, he campaigned on the promise that there would be deep tax cuts in 2019 post him being elected. This was also the time when parallelly Asian Development Bank had flagged this deficit which was going on in Colombo. This was a twin deficit which was going on, the trade deficit as well as the budget deficit. But nobody paid attention to the fact that if there would be deep tax cuts, how would the government get revenue? Well, the credit rating agencies were all ears, and they started to downgrade Sri Lanka to near default levels as they sensed the upcoming crisis. Soon, the investors fled the country, and the roads of access to the international markets were blocked for Lanka. Post being elected to the office, President decided to invite yet another crisis that was perturbing the already economic one. The next one was a ban on the fertilizer for food production without predicting its long-term implications. While this was whitewashed and projected as a concern for public health, analysts revealed that it intended to save foreign reserves by canceling imports of fertilizers, which were actually occupying a large part. But this added to the trouble as now there were food shortages, and the country had to import for the first time its staple food, white rice. Now, this actually led to further depletion of the reserves. And then religion came into picture as actually a vote bank. So, to appeal the Sinhalese for votes, the Rajapaksa government had resorted to intensive infrastructure investments, which was actually the development approach that the monks had preferred. These investments turned out to be irrational decisions that played almost no role in boosting the economy and instead pushed Sri Lanka into China's debt trap. Further, the economy was completely crippled when its tourism-dependent economy faced major setback. So the contribution of the tourism industry amounts to about 11 to 12% of the GDP. But this revenue completely stopped because of two factors. Initially, because of the fear that had developed because of the Easter bombings in April 2019. And this was closely followed by the COVID situation. So the situation in 2021 can be described as lack of revenue from tourism, from taxes, drastically reduced remittances, raging pandemic, and to top it all, lending by no lending by foreign agencies. So to avert these loan amounts that were at an ever increasing rate, the currency was devalued in order to attract remittances. But this too backfired, and it led to a reduction in the people's purchasing power. So now Sri Lanka is engulfed not just in debt but also in inflation that has led to the food being priced at ever increasing rates, leading to a major food crisis and followed by a major fuel crisis. So soaring inflation, bleeding foreign reserves, piles of debt, and a tanking currency. The perfect recipe for disaster that Sri Lanka has right now.
Thank you, Soumya, for those very detailed and insightful points. Shani, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, Soumya provided like a very good overview of the whole situation. I would just, before we move on to talking about what might have led to the crisis, something, I think I would just first list some of the things that are happening in Sri Lanka right now. So, like as Soumya mentioned, it's like the worst economic crisis that the country has ever experienced. The country has defaulted on its foreign debts, so like it's not able to pay its foreign debt. Um, Also, the country is not able to like pay for imports, and as she mentioned, there's an inflation. So the reason for that inflation is because the country can't pay for its necessity of fuel. So this is how bad the situation is. Earlier, 1 kilo of rice in Sri Lanka would have costed around 50, no, sorry, around 80 Sri Lankan rupees. Now it costs around 500 Sri Lankan rupees. So it's like that. The inflation is still high at the moment, and added to that is the civil unrest in the country. Like the Rajapaksa government, they have announced a state of emergency in the country, which has also led to a lot of protests. Protests were there anyway, but it has like aggravated the protest, and the state of emergency can just further worsen the situation of basic rights in the country. So that's that.
Thank you, both Soumya and Ishani for those insightful points. Like, what I think of it, it's important to look at inflation whenever a particular country is like facing such a crisis, because these are the realities of economic crisis. Right? So when we talk about economic crisis, it often can lead to some very abstract notions of it, but people are actually facing, they can't. They're not being able to afford bread or anything, etc. And as Ishani was mentioning about the civil unrest in the country. So, like we have various macroeconomic models, showing how sometimes economic growth is a function of civil, basically stability, or we can say peace and all that. So it's interesting to note whether it's even possible in a climate of, say, protest, in a climate of civil unrest, in any sort of economic growth is even possible for to take Sri Lanka out of this particular mess. Yeah. Amia,
I
would you like
think
to?
now that we have an objective idea of what's going on in Sri Lanka, and the panelists laid out various factors that have led to it, I think we'd like to know whether, in your opinion, do you feel it was bad governance and mismanagement on the part of the incumbent party that played a role in leading to the situation? Or is it more so because of the existential threat of COVID and other reasons, such as the heavy dependence on tourism and imports? What like, has this been going on for many years and was COVID the trigger point, or do you think it was bound to happen anyways? Yes, Soumya, go ahead.
So I think this economic mismanagement has been successive, though it has been aggravated by COVID, but the policies that were inclined to keep the Rajapaksa family in power actually led to all of it. And I think most importantly, as you correctly mentioned, COVID, when I talk about COVID that came into picture and aggravated this crisis, I can just blame the fact that the economy is not well diversified. That is why the impact of COVID has been such, like has had such adverse impacts. Otherwise, I think economic mismanagement in general is one of the things that has led us to this.
Thank you, Soumya, for those very insightful points. Rushil?
Yeah, I actually agree with Soumya because the Sri Lankan economy is increasingly very reliant on tourism and it has not diversified its sources of income, its sources of national income. And so COVID was the final death blow because all tourism had ceased at that time. But it was also, I think, one more point I want to mention, it's also Rajapaksa's failure and it's also the growing Sri Lankan angst against IMF's plans because IMF had sort of created this restructured loan, which had a very harsh reservicing or harsh repayment plan. And a lot of people in Sri Lanka were extremely aggravated against IMF, and Rajapaksa himself continued to default on IMF loans that were provided to the Sri Lankan economy. That and also the increasing reliance on tourism. The demise of both of those amidst COVID ultimately was the last nail in the coffin, in my opinion, in the Sri Lankan crisis.
Thank you, Rushil. That was very well summarized. And Ishani, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, like even I think that it has to be both economic mismanagement and COVID. I feel I mean, still, only Rajapaksa cannot be blamed for the economic mismanagement. The reason is that, yeah, he did a lot of blunders. Like the tax cuts was a major blunder, and it shouldn't have happened. Then the ban on fertilizers, that was also like a major blunder. But other than that, I feel like there were hints of this happening since a long time. So I think it was around 2012 that Sri Lanka's GDP started falling. And yet, the country did not take much initiatives, not just Rajapaksa's government, but even the governments before that, diversify their exports. And there was a time when they were reliant on tourism a lot. And then COVID happened, all the border closures, and that is what aggravated the situation, as they've mentioned. But I also feel, along with having economic and the pandemic factor, there's also a very political factor, which is very interesting to see that to which extent a politician can go, like that could just lead to a country being totally devastated just to win an election. And that is kind of what happened when Rajapaksa claimed that he would give tax cuts, and that is a major reason why he got elected in the 2019 elections. Other than that, I also feel there's the foreign interference. Rushil mentioned about the IMF, but I also think that China has a major role to play. I mean, it's very interesting that the countries that China is investing in, like both of their economies are in not a very good state. For example, there's Pakistan and then there's Sri Lanka, and the whole Hambantota port scenario that happened. So the whole theory about China trapping countries into debt, I feel that is very relevant when it comes to Sri Lanka. And when we're talking about the factors that led to the crisis, we cannot really ignore foreign interference and how China did have a role to play in worsening the debt crisis in the country.
Thank you, Ishani. I think the electoral perspective was extremely insightful and something that hasn't been widely spoken about, but a great way of looking at it. Soumya, do you have anything else to add?
Yeah, I'd just like to add to what Ishani just said. I feel this political agenda, that like the economic situation of Sri Lanka turning into a political agenda, was a major factor that led to this crisis. Because around 2019, when the Asian Development Bank warned China, they flagged their deficit, their increasing deficit. That was the time when most people thought, they anticipated that this is the time, that this is the right time when Sri Lanka shall go and ask for the IMF's assistance to bail it out of the crisis. But the Rajapaksa government wanted to show that they were self-reliant and did not want to go and seek help openly. That is the time that they decided to actually intensify their investments and their agreements with China. And that is the time that this debt began to become a trap. So this idea of showing that the government is self-reliant and does not have to go and ask for help from IMF was actually a way of telling people that they can trust them. But I think that has led to the worsening of this crisis.
So both Rushil and you brought up the IMF, and the IMF has played the most crucial role when it comes to providing aid. And I mean, in addition to this, the World Bank has readied a Sri Lanka package. And do you think that the increasing dependency on economic international organizations is a sustainable solution? Malik, would you want to go ahead and answer that?
Yeah, thanks a lot. Uh, so the relying on, if you just look at the trajectory of South Asian nations since 1950, uh, two nations which Vishani just spoke of, Pakistan and Sri Lanka, both these nations have been taking several loans, have been engaged in several programs with IMF. For like Sri Lanka has been engaged in it for 16 times, Pakistan more than that. So the origin of this engaging with international multilateral financial organizations is much longer than the present crisis. The present crisis is just the most immediate manifestation of it. The reliance although $600 million from World Bank, yeah, it's a good thing, and 300 was already extended, but it comes with strings attached, and the strings attached have mostly to do with the boilerplate IMF programs like restructuring, rationalization of state public sector enterprises, increasing a great stress was laid on increasing the revenue to tax to GDP ratio, and even in that, more stress was laid on the increasing in VAT and sales taxes, so which are going to directly impact the Sri Lankan populations. And the thing about rationalization is that who is going to be let off those state-owned enterprises. So in immediate terms, Sri Lanka is going to face mass unemployment because of that. This reliance on international aid organizations in the short term, yeah, it will just keep Sri Lankan situation it will just hold its nose about over it. But it's not going to structurally help Sri Lanka emerge out of the crisis, because this is a nation which has been in the arms of IMF. It was the first South Asian nation to enter into as a board member of IMF in 1950, and since then 16 loans. So there's something deeper than what's going on. Yeah, it was exacerbated by populist policies of the Rajapaksa clan and the COVID economic crisis and the impact of Easter bombings. But this is something which has a longer history, and no economic plan since 1950, no IMF structural aid or World Bank economic assistance has helped Sri Lanka get out of it. You can actually think of the Chinese turn of both Sri Lankan and Pakistani economies as a way of sort of diversifying the sources of help, which we used to be only reliant on in the IMF and World Bank before that. Now they sort of wanted other organizations to come in and sort of get a little more leverage, but that hasn't worked out. They weren't able to cope with both of them, and now both the economies are suffering. So yeah, the reliance is not good, but they don't have many options unless India comes in. So that's a different.
Thank you, Malik. Rushil?
Yeah, I sort of want to add on to the very interesting point that Malik had made of the Sri Lankan economy on these 8 plans. I think what we also have to consider is that international organizations such as the IMF and World Bank are also, in a certain sense, invasive parties. Because if you look at the IMF, they are giving you aid, but they have set very harsh principles and very hard terms and conditions to abide by, which includes drastic cuts in public spending reforms, tax reforms, and whatnot. And these significantly alter the domestic processes of a nation. So when an IMF gives you an aid and whatnot, it is investing itself in the domestic processes of the country itself, be it the institutional processes, be it the governmental processes, whatnot. So when we look at these IMF aid plans, we should not think of them as a very humanitarian sort of a gift that an economy is saving. They are also inducing very harsh terms through the structural programs itself. And I sort of understand in a certain sense Rajapaksa's alignment to China, because China does not impose such harsh conditions. China has a very laissez-faire system of aid, because it targets countries which are especially politically unstable and has this lease system. But Rajapaksa's alignment in China is a staunch retort to IMF's increasing role in the domestic political processes of unstable countries, of economically weak nations. And in that sense, Rajapaksa's alignment with China kind of makes sense.
Thank you. And moving forward, since we've discussed India and China and the importance Sri Lanka has to both these countries, and we know that a lot of Indian companies have invested and established their presence in Sri Lanka. These include Indian Oil, Airtel, Taj Hotels, Dabur, Tata Communications, even ICICI Bank. But in spite of this, Sri Lanka does hold a minor importance to India in terms of trade. But like you all mentioned with regard to China, it is an important country since India needs to counter the growing Chinese influence on its economy. What implications do you think the crisis will have on India-Sri Lanka relations? Malik, you can go ahead and answer that.
Certainly, I mean, the rise of influence of China in the Indian neighborhood is no secret, and especially in Sri Lanka, the Hambantota Port being given, I like that. So it's no secret they invested heavily. They invested in the current setup, and they invested specifically in the Rajapaksa clan. The previous government tried to sort of lean away from them. It wasn't successful, and they invested in this setup specifically to sort of have roots. You can see it going on similarly in Pakistan, in Nepal. So that would be a more relevant example. But China cannot influence Sri Lanka the way India can, because ultimately India is the neighbor. India has historical ties. India has cultural ties. So it can operate on state to state level. It can operate on government to government level. But the deep penetration which India has, only India can build upon. And this is a golden opportunity. I mean, yes, obviously the Sri Lankan state, especially the Rajapakshas, will try to sort of let the India and China counter it for their own benefit, as can be expected from smaller players. But uh, instead of engaging the way China does with Sri Lanka, and that's the only way they can engage is on the state-to-state level, sort of lending and buying out some more time for them. India can engage on a much deeper level. It can engage on a more societal level. It can open up. So, okay, Sri Lanka is suffering from low tourist footfall. India can tell them, okay, reduce your restrictions and make it easier for Indians to visit there. And why wouldn't any Indian want to visit Sri Lanka? You can increase your footfall there. You can already leverage the existing assets you have there in form of people and the enterprises you have set up and mobilize on that level. So you can invest in the Sri Lankan society itself, irrespective of which government is in power. Now, China cannot do that. It doesn't have that ability. It doesn't have that, like you cannot do in Taiwan or any other neighboring nation of China. China doesn't have a similar capacity here in this neighborhood. So yeah, India does have a golden opportunity, but it shouldn't mimic what China and other organizations should do. Its approach has to be relatively different.
Thank you, Malik. And Soumya, would you now like to go ahead and add to that?
Sure. So I totally agree that India has a golden opportunity, but I like to reinstate that the opportunity is not to displace China, because I feel that the Sri Lankans cannot stop relying on China and try to loosen the grip of China, even if the pro-Chinese Gotabaya administration is replaced by a new regime under the pressure of the ongoing public protests. So the idea, like the relationship of India and Sri Lanka does not only have China as a factor in it, it also has other factors. For example, the tension that continues because of India's motives vis-a-vis the Tamil cause in Sri Lanka, and also the lack of trust that not just Sri Lanka, but a lot of countries can show because of India's slow bureaucratic processes. That is where China takes an edge when it comes to attracting investment opportunities. So I think that even if like India can actually improve its relationship with Sri Lanka, because the Sri Lankan government, especially post the pandemic, has realized that it needs to not put a lot of faith in one foreign policy, and the economy of the country needs to be diversified vis-a-vis the thing that they had done with China earlier. So they know now that they need to look for assistance from other bilateral partners too. And that is where India could play a great role and be a great bilateral partner. But I think it would be naive to think that India could replace China right now. I think the kind of instability in Sri Lanka, be it political, social, economic, it is not in India's interests. So due to the geographical proximity, we know that India will be the first South Asian region to feel the repercussions of this man-made or natural disaster in the island nation. So I think that is also why, irrespective of how this is going to affect the India-China relations, it is important for India to step in and help Sri Lanka out of this crisis.
Thank you, Soumya. Ishani?
Yes, so I do agree with Malik and Soumya both. I feel like it is definitely a golden opportunity for India. And also India does not really have the capability, at least right now, to completely displace or replace China's influence in Sri Lanka. But talking in some realist sense, I feel that India can act like a big brother in the situation. And time and again, India has claimed that, to counter China's influence in the whole South Asian region, India has claimed that, it wants to assume the role of a security provider. And this is where India's ambitions of being, a big brother to say such small neighboring countries comes into play. Also, when I'm talking about India, about that, I also feel that Sri Lanka's geographical location, not just being in like proximity to India, but also given that it's like very much in the Indo-Pacific region, and also it's really important that China does not trap it into debt so much so that it like virtually controls the country in some sense. And that is what happened with the Toda port. Like China has gotten it, and that port is literally of so much strategic importance, especially when China has, some um, uh, uh, bad intentions when it comes to India. So this is where India really needs to step in, not just for helping Sri Lanka, but also for its own interests. Countering China in the Indo-Pacific region, securing its own security. That is something that's really important, and India has been doing that, I feel. And I also think that there's a void that has with China's whole, there's a little bit of anti-China, anti-IMF resentment in the country's public, in Sri Lankan public, and that has actually left a void for India to come in. And as I think someone mentioned, that India should not do what China was doing, and rather have a more supportive role to play in Sri Lanka.
Thank you, Shani, for those that very insightful answer. And before we conclude, I think it's important to consider how the situation will pan out. So, especially since Sri Lanka has declared emergency, of course, we can only speculate. But what do you all think?
Soumya, you had your hand up, so would you like to?
I just wanted to add about how Shani was talking about India's interests in this whole scenario. So we know that India has extended a credit line to China, but in foreign and bilateral affairs, nothing comes free. There are always like strings attached to whatever you give and whatever you get. So I wanted to talk about like the basic developments that have been taking place right now between Sri Lanka and India vis-a-vis the economic thing, the projects of economic importance. So how they have signed this contract of the oil tank farm jointly, which the Adani Group will be investing by developing in the Western Container Terminal in the Colombo port. So likewise, it will also invest in the energy projects in north and the east of Sri Lanka. So I guess the way the situation is progressing, the more help we lend to Sri Lanka to help her out of the crisis, it is also going to be reciprocated with some amount of economic opportunities that were earlier not explored.
Yes, Shani, would you like to add?
Yeah, I would just want to say I agree with her definitely, and also about the question that was raised regarding what could happen in Sri Lanka. I feel given that the state of emergency has been declared, and like the country is going to be experiencing a lot of outrage from the people, no matter whether a state of emergency or not, they are going to be facing a lot of that. And I think somewhere in the near future, there would definitely be a change in the government. And maybe Sri Lanka would be able to, better manage this crisis if it like implements some good reforms, that economic and policy reforms. And yeah.
Thank you, Shani. Malik, would you like to have the last word?
Certainly not the last word. Just a small point. I will go a little more pessimistic on this front. I don't think there are going to be some fundamental reforms, nor do I think whatever our plan is going or have its power substantially reduced. They are too deeply entrenched, and the opposition is too weak and fragmented to actually take the space. So, yeah, the state might actually, the ruling elite might actually suffer some losses in its kept power, but it's not going to be filled by any credible opposition. Maybe it will just spill out in this populist space. Maybe some aspects of governance will become more difficult in Sri Lanka. Maybe it will not, it will lean towards more instability. But I don't think any this top-down imposition of reforms by IMF or any external any external power is going to fundamentally reshape the internal politics of Sri Lanka. If that's to happen, some civic resistance under the leadership of a credible opposition figure with an alternative platform, alternative vision for Sri Lanka has to emerge. And right now, that's not visible.
That there are always two ways of looking at it, and it's completely understandable to take a pessimistic view or a realistic view, however you look at it, especially given what all we've discussed. And Soumya, what do you think?
I don't know. I mean, I do agree with Malik to some extent, but there is also this fix that is created in my mind when I think about it, because yes, they have suffered losses in terms of their power. Earlier, the Rajapaksa clan had 7 important positions to hold, and now it has been reduced to 1. But still, people do insist that that one position is also eliminated. Yeah, I agree that there is nobody else who can fill up, but then what? Because as Krishanu mentioned, that the civil unrest is going to affect economic growth, and people are insisting that this civil unrest would end only if the Rajapaksa clan is completely eliminated. So how do we see the situation? Will the civil unrest keep increasing because we do not have a powerful opposition? Or can we say that there will be some point where we hand in the country to a weaker opposition just to focus on economic growth? That is the dilemma that is being created when I think about the Sri Lanka situation, right?
Interesting way to look at it, and only time will tell how this pans out and which one of us was more accurate. Rushil?
Yeah, I think Sri Lanka is on the brink of state failure, to be honest. We should also remember that for better part of a decade, or less than a decade ago, Sri Lanka was fighting LTTE militants. And there was a very powerful militant presence in Sri Lanka itself. It already has the support of the Sri Lankan Tamils. And it's not out of the scope of reality that militancy would again come by in Sri Lanka, and we might even see some civil war conflicts happening within Sri Lanka itself. So I think this is a very problematic and quite dangerous time for Sri Lanka itself. Obviously, tourism is going to bounce back considering how far it had fallen off, but Sri Lanka has a very potent threat of militancy, and a civil war conflict might be brewing as we speak.
Certainly, those were very excellent points. In fact, everybody covered, all the nuances that might be, possibly affecting Sri Lanka coming out of the crisis, like all the factors that could have led to the crisis, like for example, things related to, electoral issues and tourism not functioning as it should be, and defaulting of loans, and relying on loans as a way for economic growth, in a sense, might have led Sri Lanka to this particular point, and it's difficult for them to come out now because of that reason. But again, as we were debating about whether India would intervene in that matter in the way it should, like Malik suggested that, okay, soft power politics might be the way, like travel, opening up of travel avenues and etc. And others suggested that economic interventions by Adani and other powerful corporates in Sri Lanka. But again, how would you incentivize them to do so? Because this is again a very risk-filled venture. Investing in a particular country that is going through very unprecedented levels of economic crisis. So yeah, I think this was an excellent discussion, and it raised very pertinent points about how do you navigate a crisis, and what happens when you are in fact a country that's just neighboring that particular country, and it's very important in the calculus of international relations pertaining to your country. So I think this is a great case study to take up to understand Indian foreign policy and economic policy in general. And I thank everybody who joined to the end for everybody's very insightful points, and I hope that everybody took off something, as I hope for our audience as well. And yeah, until next time, thank you guys. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you.